Hi there. Welcome to Perceptual Optics. This is the third class. We're going to be looking at bank necessities. Okay, this is what we're going to be covering in the class. Pause the video and check it out if you're interested. But in general, we're going to be looking at the bank, which is kind of like a 3D Etch-a-Sketch, or just like a volume for keeping mental imagery. And it's pretty similar to Baddeley's working memory model, which we will also look at. Try looking at this shape and then closing your eyes and seeing if you can fold it into a cube just with your imagination. I think you'll find that you're able to do it roughly, and that will just demonstrate that you're able to mentally rotate objects and envision in 3D. I'd like you to do this example. Close your eyes and count how many windows are in your living room. So how did you do it? I assume you probably made some kind of mental image of the room and then brought your attention along one wall and counted up the windows, and if you had two walls of windows, moved your attention to the second wall and counted it up as well. And that just shows us that within imagination it's possible to move around to different locations, kind of bring your mind's eye to various spots, or bring your attention to various spots within imagination. This is the Necker cube illusion, and it's pretty interesting because if you focus on point A, you see one orientation of the cube, but then if you focus on point B, you may be able to get it to pop into a completely different orientation. And what that shows us is the same visual input can be interpreted in two different spatial layouts. Multi-stability is the idea that given one particular visual input, you can have a stable perception of a face, but you can also have another stable perception, namely that of this entire vase. So you can kind of flip between the perception of the one and perception of the other, ostensibly because faces would be one shape similarity, and the vase is kind of stored in its own category. So you're just looking at one or the other. This illusion is pretty cool because it's not just two different ways that you can see it. It's actually at least four. So you can see these dots as going up and down, up, down, up, down. You could see it as going left, right, like right, left, right, left, right, left. You could also see it as clockwise rotation, doop, 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 doop. Or you could imagine it as a counterclockwise rotation. So, and if you imagine like an axis in the middle connecting the two dots, and then you imagine turning it that way, or you go from there, turn it the other way, then you can kind of use your imagination to control how you see something. While the bank may seem like a new concept, and it certainly has not been proven, nevertheless, it's very similar to this theory that was put forth by Baddeley and Hitch. Actually, I think it was in 1974 that they put the theory out, and it's this mental workspace theory, which is kind of like a 3D Etch-a-Sketch or something. You know, it's basically a 3D volume for you to make and manipulate mental imagery. In the Baddeley model, you have basically this controller at the front, central executive, and you have these three components. You have this 3D sketch pad, you have the phonological loop, and you have the basically posterior parietal cortex acting as episodic buffer, kind of combining all the modalities together and holding a temporary buffer. And each of these can communicate with storing into long-term memory. One of the nice things about this model is that you can fuse particular imagery to the hearing of speech or to the making of speech, and basically kind of thereby imbue it with meaning and understanding. You can also see here where they have the episodic buffer, and ACC is the anterior cingulate cortex, and of course prefrontal cortex acting as the controller. Assuming I understand Baddeley's model correctly, I would like to include all of it in the bank model, and then I want to add certain things onto it. So within the Baddeley model, he basically advocates that there needs to be a space for drawing 2D and 3D imagery. He wants to allow transformation, that is mental rotation of that volume, mental scaling, mental moving of the volume. He also wants the option of fusing the contents of the sketchpad, the imagery, in real time with the phonological loop, including Broca's area, which is subvocal rehearsal of speech sounds and words. So if you're thinking about something you want to say, you can be linking it to this mental imagery at the same time. And the same thing with Wernicke's area, where you're processing auditory information that you're hearing, somebody's talking, and Wernicke is processing it. You can still link it to the visual spatial sketchpad so that you're conjuring up this mental imagery automatically to give you meaning and understanding of the language. Another component is that there needs to be storage of the 2D and 3D imagery, like the actual shapes, the 2D perimeters, the 3D surfacial skins or point clouds of these objects need to be storable to memory in some way or another. So there has to be kind of some way of mapping to the voxels, or some way of artificially keeping track of specific shapes, perimeters, surfaces. And then last of all, I'm not sure if he argued this or not, but I think it needs to be included, is that the stored imagery can stay fixed where it was stored on the sketchpad. So if you got this sketchpad and you save something like to right here, like a cup, then it's always saved right there in that orientation. So you can then rotate the thing and scale the thing, and it always stays fixed or glued to that one particular location. So, like I said, I would like to include all of Baddeley's model in my own concept of the bank, but I want to add these specific things to it. First of all, that this where you store things on the sketchpad is categorizable. So certain shapes can go to certain places. Writing can go to a certain location. Tool usage can go to a certain location. And you don't just throw things around wherever willy-nilly on the structure. Secondly, memory needs to encode actual voxel locations within perceptual space or within the bank, allowing similar shapes that are stored overlaying each other to slightly trigger each other so that you have understanding and familiarity. So the neural ensembles underlying other cup representations could be just slightly triggered by, holding, a coffee cup or something, but they're not firing as loudly as the coffee cup. So it's just, it gives you understanding of these related concepts, and you can go there, you can move there, but it's more just like familiarity, just a little bit of a hint of something. Thirdly, the bank schema serves as a tether between the real-world schema, which is this stuff out here and this body here, and the imagination schema, which usually occupies some overlaying volume, and it's usually seems invisible to us, although I would argue it's just extremely low opacity or low visibility. Fourth, sensory and motor information is assigned a temporal and spatial alignment, moment by moment, via stored episodic memory traces left recorded onto the bank tether. In other words, Christoph Koch argues that consciousness happens in frames, like 10 a second, 10 frames per second. I would say it's variable, but that's fine. So 10 hertz, that's 0.1 seconds. Okay, so within that cycle, I say that there's this phasic evolution, and you start first with just some point, and this point is it has a mappable address within the real world schema. It also has some location within the imagination schema. More importantly, it has some location on the bank. So you have all three structures overlaying. Imagination might be tilted like that, and bank might be over here, and the real world is like this with anti-gravity up like that. So you've got these three different realms that can kind of rotate a little bit, but for alignment purposes, let's have some zero-dimensional point or voxel that we all agree to on this particular millisecond. And then, you know, at 100 different intervals within that cycle, so like 1 millisecond each, it's changing its location to draw a ring. Okay, and then after the ring is drawn, you can flesh out like the whole plane, and from there you can understand the whole volume. And you may not even have to flesh out the volume. It may be that enough is encoded in the plane that as the planes change over time, you kind of hallucinate that we have this full understanding of the whole 3D volume because it feels exactly the same. But it could also flesh it out. I don't know for sure. But that's kind of the phasic evolution. So it'd be like one ring that becomes a plane that becomes a volume in one cycle. And then we usually just only notice the 3D volume. But then the zero-dimensional point that traces out a ring, it's got maybe 100 different stops along the way. So, every millisecond I'm arguing that your brain is moving the point that it's considering to be the clapperboard or the alignment particle for all of its activities. And then also, let's see here. So the last slide, it was having trouble recording the whole video and it kept erasing it, so I'll just do the last of it here. So the last 2 points on the last slide was talking about triggers and skewers, and then it was also talking about how radial distance on the bank could be used to encode age of memory. In other words, as you place some set of memories onto the bank skewered by some commonality, at the outermost layer, you're looking at the most recent experience of that memory, and then as you go further in, all the way down to the centroid of the bank is the very oldest, like when you're a child, memories from way back then. And not that necessarily these things are always stored on the bank like this, but that when you conjure memories, it lays it out in this kind of radial spatial fashion to give you understanding of which it would consider to be most pertinent, the most recent, going all the way back. And then the whole thing with triggers and skewers is that your hippocampal loop. So you go from entorhinal cortex to dentate gyrus to CA3 to CA1 to subiculum, and then back to the entorhinal cortex, and that communicates with the whole cortex. So on the first step, or the first stop, which is dentate gyrus, they say that it does pattern extraction. So basically, it's looking for whatever things are unique within that moment of experience. And if it has seen those unique aspects before, it just saves them to that commonality table that it already has. If it's something completely new, it's going to have to create a new table, a new commonality, a new abstract concept. So they call that like a concept cell, a Jennifer Aniston neuron, a grandmother cell, or set of this ensemble of neurons that's dedicated to represent that one unique abstract concept, a particular person, a particular color you could have a thing for. In fact, it probably, could be that V4 has something like that. You could have, you could filter by literally anything. So that's kind of the amazing thing with the human brain is it can do that. And then, so after dentate gyrus, you have CA3, that's pattern completion. So once you've found some unique aspect of this moment of experience that you want to focus on, you dig up all the memories from that, and it becomes like a skewer going back in time. And then you're going to pick the most salient or pertinent or useful of those and replay like a 0.1 second clip. So once you get to CA1, it reaches in to the rest of the cortex and says, hey, replay 0.1 second of this specific experience. And it's not perfect, but you get just a little glimpse of, oh yeah, I remember that, So that's kind of the hippocampal loop. Bank clarifications, this is very subjective, very kind of out there, but maybe the sampling rate, a higher sampling rate is more like routine action, and then a lower sampling rate can increase your creativity because it gives you more time to change between shapes. Very subjective, but or very speculative, but kind of interesting. Okay, so why is the bank necessary? For one thing, voxel skins are 3D objects made up of individual voxels, like 3D pixels. So you need this storage space for putting it. To save voxel skins, they must be stored relative to an invariant Euclidean storage system like XYZ, and allow for rotation, scaling, and translation of that Euclidean space. This enables multiple voxel skins to be overlaid in the same 3D space for neatness and familiarity. And then we'll also look a little bit later about color representation and perception. Okay, the bank can be thought of as a transformable, organized shape structure with a definite forwards, right, and up direction. How do you know that? Because the cut is facing up, it's offset to the right, and the crack in it is facing forwards. And from that you could extract backwards, left, bottom. In fact, you could extract any of the infinity of 3D vectors coming from the origin going outwards. Let's see here. The entire bank, of course, can be rotated, scaled, translated as needed for understanding an object within the real-world schema. This is not the best example because I wanted to rotate this in a 3D plane, like out of the page or something, but it still gives you an idea that one particular shape can be recognized regardless of scale, regardless of rotation, and that's something that's difficult for computers, but we are able to do. So you could call that like viewpoint invariance. The shape is still recognizable, and one way that could be is if there's a 3D skin of the object saved. Now some people argue against that because they say, well, if you show people the bottom of an object, they're less likely to, or it takes them longer to recognize basically what that object is. And I mean, like, to me, that's not a problem. I mean, it's like, okay, I mean, you get less visual input of the bottom of things. So, you know, the 2D image can still kind of help to trigger the understanding of something, but at the end of the day, I still think it's important that the brain has an understanding of the 3D point cloud of an object, its entire 3D footprint. So Euclidean space is actually difficult to subdivide in the sense that if you imagine yourself being at the origin, looking outwards, humans can only see in the frontwards direction, but you could always turn your head, or you could have a magical eye that allowed you to see in all three dimensions, or directions, I should say, at once, you know, the entire sphere simultaneously. So if that were the case, then how would we divide the surface of that, like the vectors coming out of that? Like, how would we order their arrangement? And the answer is there really isn't a good way, because a sphere surface cannot be divided very nicely. One of the few ways that it can is if you just want to divide it into 8 segments. Well, you could slice it in half, and then slice it in half another axis, and then plane, slice it in half another plane, and you get basically these 3 kind of half, cut in half cantaloupe slices, or these, 8 of those that would be, the same size pixel and the same shape pixel. But in general, the surface of the sphere, if you got to divide it up into, 100 or 200 or 200 million pixels, different vector orientations, there's not really a neat way to do it, unfortunately. And what does the retina do? Well, it just crams the cones and rods in there kind of willy-nilly, the best it can. And that's really the best that you can do, because, if you try to divide a sphere neatly one way, and then along another axis, and then along another axis, you get this shape. And if you look really closely, you can see that the pixels would be just these really weird shapes, and some of them would be big, and then other of them, like this one in the middle here, is just tiny. And so it's very unequal in shape and in, size of pixel. The same thing with this kind of like cantaloupe slices. You do it in one direction, it looks kind of cool, but then when you combine the 3, you get something that looks like the surface of the moon, and it's you get these little tiny guys, these big wonky pixels, and it's just like, what can you do? And there really isn't a good solution to it. So just cramming all the rods and cones is pretty good. A sphere is a very aesthetic, symmetrical thing, but that can also be a problem, because if you have this perfect symmetry in multiple different directions, you don't have specificity. So you don't really know whether the sphere is up or down or left or right. So a bank with only spheres wouldn't really have the orientational specificity that you might desire. If you also add a cube overlaying the sphere, now the cube could be in, if you see the cube, you would only be confused with 5 other orientations of the cube that would give you that same view from any vantage point. So a lot less confusability, but it still is not perfect orientational specificity. So now if you have the sphere and the overlaid cube, and you also put a tilted cylinder offset to the right slightly and tilted, rotated clockwise slightly, and then also have some feature on the front of the glass, like a break in the glass, or you could just imagine a hand. I mean, a hand is basically the same thing as, the same shape as a broken glass, so the edges of my finger and the cylinder would be like held right there. And then the fingers kind of look like the edges of broken glass. So, you're holding an object or something. But basically when that cylinder has a feature on the front and it's offset to the right, you now have exact orientational specificity. So no matter where you look at that bank from, you know exactly which way it's up and it's left and it's right and it's front. You're never going to be confused. So it's actually very useful. The other thing is, like in this upper left drawing, here's your left eye and your right eye, and they're separated by 2 inches physically, but I think that they see through the perceptual cyclopean eye, which is kind of like right in the middle. And the test that you can do is if you hold your finger right at your nose and look in the distance, and then just look at something like maybe some feature on the wall, and just alternate between one eye and the other, and then open both eyes and then shut an eye, and just keep going back and forth. It honestly feels like your viewpoint is coming from the center, from between your eyes. Even when you're just monocular and just one eye is open, it still feels like it's coming from this center point. And in fact, that makes a lot of sense, because if you imagine these 2 eyes as having all these rays coming out of it, which is basically like all the rays of light coming in, but let's imagine them going out, and it's focused on some focal point, and there's one central ray from each eye. Okay, so if you take those 2 eyes and overlay them, now every single 3D vector is the same geometric orientation of left eye and of right eye. Now what they see has been counter-rotated, this cross disparity coming from the focal point towards you. The whole overlaid 3D scene of left eye and right eye gets turned like that, and far things get pulled apart. So like, in other words, if I hold one finger here and look at it, hold another finger further away, I'm going to see 2 copies of the further finger if I'm focused on the close one. That's because it's that uncrossed disparity. The 2 3D scenes got pulled apart. But the beauty with bringing the 2 eyes together is that now you have all these vector orientations that any pixel from either retina can be put right next to each other and then combined, basically. And because that's what we see in the visual cortex. We see the center foveal region goes to one spot in the visual cortex of the left, coming from the left eye, and then the same region coming from the right eye, and then 5 degrees theta to the left of that, goes to one spot, and then from the other eye it comes to that same spot. So you see these ocular dominance columns of left eye, right eye, left eye, right eye, and it's like it's merging the vectors together, and that's the cyclopean eye thing. So that could be actually extremely useful for simplifying the work needed to make 3D out of 2D. We generally think of Euclidean space as having 3 axes or 6 vector directions, that is forwards, backwards, left, right, up, and down. And these could be considered as, vectors going through the faces of a cube, the center of the faces of a cube. But it really would be helpful to learn a few extra vectors. So I'm going to challenge you to think outside the box and adopt some extra vectors here. If you look at the vectors going from the centroid through the 8 vertices of the cube, you now know 8 new vectors, and we're going to name these later on. If you also go from the centroid to the midpoint of all the edges of the cube, you now have 12 new vectors, including these ones coming at the mid-tier, going outwards. So that's actually going to be very useful for considering 3D space. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. So this here is just completely conceptual, but if we consider the mid-level of this cube, and this is not the bank anymore, this is just a cube, this forwards direction could be represented by red. Forwards and a little bit to the right could be orange, and then yellow going to the right, green, blue, blue, purple. Straight up would be white, straight down would be black, and right at the centroid of the cube you could have gray. And these could be also, not only showing you kind of color space with the full saturation of color in the mid-tier and then going lighter, going up towards white, and darker going towards black, but you could also use this to help remember the 26 vector directions that we're just talking about. So, you already know forwards is, from the center to the red, right, left, back, up, down. But then you can also consider these others, like this way, and coming to this, and then to that. So we'll look at this a little bit more in the next couple slides. So we used color to kind of help elucidate these different directions, but now let's assign a letter or a number system to it. So the vector going from the centroid up could be 1, or the letter A. And since there's 26 of these, we can just use the English alphabet. So that would be A, and then coming towards you would be B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, out here. And then you would jump down in the spiral, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q. Jump down once again, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y. And then jump down to straight down would be Z. And you could do the same thing with the numbering system, like 1 would be up, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And then going straight down would be 26. The centroid could be 0, or if you're using the lettering system, maybe just use a period, since unfortunately English doesn't have 27 letters, it only has 26. But that's actually pretty useful, and we're going to look at that even a little further. So like I said, this is kind of a spiral naming of vectors, and starting from the one going straight up with 1, and then coming towards you, this, considering this as a space for objects we're looking at. Okay, so the orientation that's upwards and facing you is B, or 2, and it just keeps spiraling around. C, D, E, F, going up and backwards, G, H, I, and then jump down, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q. Again, the J is the forwards direction facing you. And then facing you and down is R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and then jumping straight down is Z, or 26. So in reality, geometrically, there's an infinity of different vectors coming from the centroid outward towards the unit sphere. If you think of a unit sphere in terms of square degrees, there's 41,253 different orientations. The brain seems to be able to discern somewhere around 200 million different vector orientations. So we're talking, planar orientation or just vector orientation. So it's kind of the same thing. If you have a 3D vector orientation, you also have a planar orientation that's normal to that vector, and vice versa. This is just showing you all the vectors at once. you could also, instead of vectors, consider them as handles, coming, invisible handles coming out of an object. So if the cube were a coffee cup, you can specify, hey, I want to take its Y handle and rotate it to the H position, and so that would be a 3D orbital rotation. And so now you have a way to describe 3D rotation fairly precisely with this, considering these as handles. And we could even use these in like common speech, like, take this to this position or whatever. But as it is, we're fairly poor at describing 3D orbital rotation. It's just not something we've considered to put into language or to bother learning yet. But if we did learn it, we could definitely make use of this kind of thing. Yet another way to consider these orientations is instead of vectors or handles, is to use this lettering system or numbering system to guide the subdivision of voxels, of the one cube into 27 cubes, with the central one would be like 0, or it could be like a period or something. So you basically would need like a 27-letter alphabet. But you could also take one of these smaller cubes and reiterate and basically just subdivide it into 3 by 3 by 3, and you'd have 27 even tinier voxels in that. And then if you just iterated that 9 times, you could get down to representing any of a trillion voxels with just a single 9-letter word. Like this right here could define pretty much any voxel within human perception. And like the first letter would be like the first subdivision of the largest space into 27 smaller spaces. The second letter would be the next iteration of taking the B cube and breaking it up, and then going to the J location within it, and then take that cube and break it up and go to the J location within it, and so on and so forth. So 9 iterations, a single simple word like that, which it's not pronounceable, but still it's a pretty condensed way of representing any of a trillion spots within perceptual space. Or you could use it for computer language for mapping voxels and 3D software and stuff. So pretty cool. Okay, so now what if instead of dividing by 3, we divide by 10? Now we have, in one single step, we can go from a cube down into 1,000 different voxels. What that would mean is that now we need an alphabet that has 1,000 letters, but what we would gain is instead of having to use a 9-letter word, we can now address any of the trillion voxels with a 4 or 5-letter long word, so a little bit of an advantage. If we take this even further and divide by 100 in each direction, we have now gone to 1,000,000 voxels in one single step. And just doing 2 iterations of this, so like if we take just that one little tiny voxel right there and divide it up into 100 by 100 by 100, so into 1,000,000 little even tinier voxels, now we have a way to address any of a trillion voxels with just 2 letters. Of course, our alphabet's got to be really dadgum large. Now it's got to have 1,000,000 different letters in it. Let's take it one step further. If we divide by units of 10,000 in each direction, we solve the whole thing in one fell swoop. So basically 10,000 by 10,000 by 10,000 increments gives us 1 trillion voxels, and now they're so tiny I can't even represent them on the screen, but these voxels are printing out this 3D lady. This is like the body schema here, and here's the environment schema that she's looking at. And the whole entire thing makes up the real world schema. The only disadvantage is now our alphabet needs to have a trillion, needs to have 1 trillion letters in it. So just a really crazy big alphabet. But the advantage is any single voxel in here can be addressed with just a single letter. Okay, so now here's the real kicker. What if instead of a letter, we just take 40 neurons or 80 neurons from each cortical column. So like, let's just look at one cortical column in the cortex, like maybe the cortical column that represents, a receptive field of the tip of my left index finger, which would be on the right somatosensory cortex. And if we just take 40 or 80 neurons from that column, we now have a way to represent whether I'm touching the finger at this location, or this location, or this location, or any of the trillion locations within perceptual space. And not only for this column, but for all the different receptive field columns over my whole brain, so that now I have true proprioception. I can close my eyes. I know exactly where all this stuff is, even though I'm not seeing it. I have a knowledge of where it is within perceptual space because we took 40 to 80 neurons and we used random, basically subpopulations of those 40 or 80 to represent all, the patterning would be different letters of the alphabet. So we can I think from just 40 or 80 neurons, you can easily represent probably well over 1 trillion different combinations. And so, like I said, each combination would then be dedicated to represent a particular spot in perceptual space, and then columns can communicate with nearby neighbors and eventually with the whole brain, so that for any particular voxel within perceptual space, and more importantly within the bank, not really perceptual space, but more importantly the bank that's shared between the whole brain, like every column, even though their ensemble are going to be different, they can still understand, okay, this particular ensemble of neurons in my column corresponds to this point, and this neighboring column has this other representation of one of his ensemble of neurons to represent this same spot. But we can get together and connect those ensembles together between the cortical columns, and finally have a little bit of connectivity across the whole brain, so that the whole brain, every single cortical column, shares this same perceptual space, and every pixel is mappable, and any particular column knows not just, hey, somebody's tapping the finger, tick, 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 this frequency. It knows where. It's exactly here. It's not over here. It's right here. And same thing for all the columns of the visual cortex, and where the things are that you're looking at. You can assign, okay, this is where it is in perceptual space. Very powerful. I think the brain has to have something like this. Of course, it has not been proven, but it would definitely make a lot of sense for it to have something like this. Or even if it didn't use the 40 to 80 neurons and use a random pattern, what if it just has, maybe something a little bit more abstract that, somehow sort of like artificial intelligence. It just has some kind of way of mapping and then getting together with the other cortical columns such that there's a shared understanding of this perceptual space. Okay, in this slide, we are looking at the bank being kind of glued to the phone because the attention is there. And then transiently, the girl shifts her attention to her torso, to her posture, her balance, and then shifts her attention back to the phone. So to the girl, it looks like the bank walks from here to her chest and then back to her phone. And if this happened in, over the course of 1 second, then, and the frames of consciousness are going at 10 hertz, then, maybe 2 or 3 frames were showing her phone, let's just say 2, okay? And then it has 1 frame where the bank is halfway between her phone and her chest, and then, there's 2 or 3 frames dedicated to the bank being on the torso and helping to control posture and teach how you want to, the autonomous systems to remember, hey, this is how to control the posture because you're bringing conscious attention to it with this bank. And then it shifts back over to here. So like maybe 1 or 2 frames in the air and then a couple frames back on the phone. And so those 10 frames of consciousness was a very transient attention shift from there and then back out. And I think there are these attention shifts all the time. In fact, I think if I wanted to tilt my head to left or right, I think that the bank is going to come there to the head and allow you to exercise conscious control over that. And then, once the bank goes somewhere else, your focus has gone somewhere else. Your attention, your consciousness has gone somewhere else, at least the most focal part. And so now the autonomous system has to kick in and control the tilting of my head and the keeping of my posture. The autonomous system tends to do things not as well as the conscious system, because when you have the conscious system, you're dedicating the entire cortex in that moment to, hey, this is how to do it. You know, the cortex can glean from all its experience, and it's going to be a lot more robust, fine-tuned control over whatever process you want to bring attention to. From our perspective, it looks like the bank is walking around within the real-world schema as we shift our attention. However, there's another way to look at it. And what's going to help us to look at it this way is first consider this. If we want to be technically correct, scientists considered this the real-world schema. This is the body schema. That is the environment schema. Together they make up the real-world schema. In other words, this is the brain's representation of the physical world, but it is not the physical world. This is only the dashboard. And if that's the case, then the brain is just as involved over there at the piano as it is here. In other words, now this will sound startling, but I think it's actually true. You can agree or not, that's up to you. But all right, inside here, I don't think the brain is actually inside here. Okay, this is my dashboard for accessing. If I take an EEG headset and put it on here, I use this dashboard to take a physical EEG headset and put it on my physical head, but my physical head is not right here. This is the brain's representation of the physical head. It's the best we'll ever get. It's the best I'll ever get. It's the closest I'll ever get to the physical world, to knowing it, to understanding it. But spatially, my brain is not inside here. This is a completely different realm from the physical world. The physical world is completely unobservable as far as like direct observation. Of course, we use our eyes, our physical eyes, to see physical light that comes in, and the brain creates certain patterns that gives us meaning and a representation that conjures up this whole thing. But it's kind of like the example of Lord of the Rings, right? They have this concept of Middle Earth, and it's a place that doesn't exist, and it's the story, right? So where is it in relation to the physical world? Well, or the physical Earth? Well, it's kind of unmappable, right? And so I think the same thing happens with the perceptual world. The brain, the representation the brain creates for us is really not even mappable to the scale or the rotation or the position of the physical world, because it's a completely separate thing. And I could be wrong on that. I don't know exactly how it all works, but if you were to take anesthesia, this environment and this body dissolves away, but somebody else can still see it. Well, why? Because they're looking at they're using their physical body to see my physical body, and they're creating a schema which could also be dissolved away with anesthesia. But while it isn't dissolved away, they can see me even though I can't see me, because I'm gone under anesthesia. So it's kind of weird to think about, but I think that is the case. So now to the point of this slide, if we, instead of imagining the bank moving around, if we look at things from the bank's reference frame, the bank is stationary. And what it's doing is it's changing what it's painting over time. So like right now it's painting the phone, now air, now the chest, now back to the air, now back to the phone. And because it's changing what it's painting, we interpret it as, oh, there's this bank structure moving around within the real world schema. But to it was just stationary. It just changed what it painted in a very precise and ordered manner to create this schema. And so if we consider it like that, and we consider the bank to be distributed over patches of the brain, different regions, then it's almost like, that is the brain, and those are the action potentials. It's almost getting down to that level that we could look at it like that. Of course, it probably has a little more encoding that happens, but I think that's pretty fascinating to look at that and think, well, that's getting pretty close to neural activity. This video is just showing the attention kept on the phone the entire duration, and you see as the angle of the hand changes slightly, the bank stays glued to that angle. And that is what I argue in my model, that's kind of what it does. And of course, if the girl brought transient attention to her legs or to her torso, to her balance, it would move there. It would shift and move there. But if we consider color opponency, which is another topic I know, but one leading idea of how the brain processes color is called color opponency. And so, color opponency refers to the way in which the human visual system processes and perceives colors. It's based on the principle that there are certain pairs of colors that are perceived as opposite to each other, that these pairs of colors cannot be perceived together at the same time. In other words, blue and yellow, red and green. In each color or each pair, one's considered to be the opponent or the opposite of the other. And kind of like that color cube thing I showed you. It would be the same thing, like the red and the green would be on opposite sides of each other. Blue and yellow would be on opposite sides. Okay, this is color opponency. So you have like blue versus yellow and red versus green. And to get that, you've got these three cones in your eye, the short cones for blue receptivity, the medium cones for green receptivity, and the long cones are honestly more for yellow receptivity, but they call it the red cones. And then the combination of these gives you the opponency. So the short cones contrasted with the summation of medium and long cones gives you blue versus yellow. And the long cones contrasted against the medium cones gives you red versus green. And there's also like light intensity, so like light versus dark, which I think uses the rods and some combination of cones. Just some more information on color opponency. If you're interested, you could pause and read a little bit there. This is a good video here by Christoph Koch on color processing. And there's a documentation talking about V4. But I think it's better to think in terms of some global mechanism for generating color. Basically because if you think about, the real world schema is most of consciousness, and the real world schema is mostly composed of color voxels. So color, is almost 100% of consciousness. Now, the meaning of consciousness seems to be carried more by the shapes or the locations of things and their changes over time and stored commonalities and sequences and things like that. But color is really a big part of it, so I don't think we need to be looking for color in some really tiny spot like V4. I think it would be smarter to look for it in, say, like the posterior parietal cortex. And in fact, they did an experiment where they showed flickering, or they showed two images, one to left eye, one to right eye, and the person would have alternating perceptions between seeing 100% of one and then 100% of the other, and they go back and forth. And when they actually applied transcranial magnetic stimulation to this region of I think it was the posterior parietal cortex, it may have been the intraparietal sulcus, but somewhere back there, they were able to have more stable perception of one, and it would just stay on that for a little while. And so what that means is that the color, the perception, was holding longer. So could it be that that region of the brain is largely responsible for painting? It could be. I don't know. As a separate note, color representation is not something that we really know yet, but I think it's possible that the 3D cursor, the 0D point that traces out a ring. I was talking about these ring paths earlier. Dynamically rotate and vibrate, all that kind of stuff. It could be that very fine temporal resolution, high frequency vibrations may be in a particular spatial direction. Any of the possibilities of 3D vectors. Not just vibration possibilities in 2D, like 0 to 360, but any of these, could wiggle like this, like that, any of these different orientations could be representing, like one plane could be dedicated to the hues of color, and then like I said, the white and the black could be that way, and then you bend the plane down or upwards to get lighter or darker hues of color. And so basically the very fine vibrations made by the dancing of these rings would be basically painting it all out. And maybe painting it out with just re-triggering memory, and then V4 could play a role, because V4 is very close to the memory system, and you could lay down, okay, this particular voxel has this, or this voxel has that, and you could trigger also like kind of a replay of whatever posterior parietal cortex was doing at that particular time, because of the brain kind of being fused together, and you fire together, wire together kind of thing. So you trigger one thing, you kind of get the whole replay. So I don't know, but it's interesting, but it's possible that maybe the rings, how they move and kind of cut the fabric that they're printing on, this kind of like 3D canvas. Maybe that's how it does it, but that's very speculative. I really don't know. We'll just go through this quickly. So some of the proposed spots within the bank for saving things, you could call it like a Dewey decimal system or something. Phones would be proposed to be saved offset to the right slightly, which is the right visual field, which is the more goes to the left hemisphere being more involved in language. That's why I think, offset to the right in the bank is the region for language, phones, tools, object, hand, cylinders, holding stuff, that kind of thing. Triggering is what we already kind of talked about, that similar shapes can help fire each other to give understanding. Like I said, reading would be offset to the right. However, if you're just kind of gazing somewhere and not reading something, then it seems like your gaze point, whatever point in 3D space you're fixated on, is going to be aligned to the centroid of the bank, because is the point in the two 3D realms of left eye, right eye, where you have perfect spatial alignment. So it makes sense for the bank's centroid to be aligned there. Interestingly enough, it seems like when the bank comes to model your torso, it inverts chirality, so it goes from right-handed to left-handed. Maybe that's a way to keep track of what is you versus what is not you, what is outside world. So like the broken glass would be kind of like right here if it's modeling your torso, which is my right lung. And if it modeled my head, theoretically it would be somewhere right in here would be the broken glass, kind of behind, kind of like. And so like if it's modeling the head, it's just a little bigger than the head, and you can use that to rotate the head or bring conscious attention to the torso for posture and balance and inertial jump. I wiggle back and forth in the chair a little bit. I have conscious awareness of that and the feeling of that. And so the bank's got to come there and record the memory of that and have conscious control over it. And then it goes to something else and gives the control back to the autonomous system. Let's see what else we got. Like I said, hands probably saved offset generally to the right visual field and to the right side of the bank. The bank is not always like lined up with your visual field, it walks around, but it could be useful to store things like that to the right side, and it seems to do that. So there's spheres in the bank. There's the glass or the cylinder, which if you turn it on its face, then it can represent a wheel, and now you have rotational ability with the bank. You actually rotate the bank to model a rotating tire when you bring attention transiently to the rotation of the tire. Or a soccer ball, it's not constrained to any particular axis, so you need to use a sphere, and the sphere of the bank can now move around without restriction to any axis. The flat surfaces of the cube could be used for printing or recording from a computer screen, like perceptually, like memories and stuff. Or a table, or a wall, or a floor, or a ceiling. And there's all these different things that are planar in our experience. So it makes sense to have a specific way to kind of paste those onto the bank or understand planar surfaces. As I said, the bank has handedness. It has a explicit orientation specificity. There can be no confusion about which way is which, but it also seems to have this instance where the handedness is mirrored, and so whether the brain just mirrors to get to that, or whether it uses some kind of four-dimensional quaternion math to do that, I don't know. But the interesting thing with quaternions is that with just 4 numbers from 0 to 1, you can, and that's like using a unit sphere, it's like 1 real number and 3 imaginary, like I, J, K. You can do any kind of 3D rotation just by adjusting those 4 digits, and it'll be a very smooth rotation. So, I don't know if the brain would bother to try to do something like that, or if it just mirrors it, or how exactly it does it. But there's this chirality that can mirror and go to this other side. The concept to think about is like, if you're a 2D person, you have a hat, you can rotate that hat like this, but I'm sorry, let me get the laser pointer. All right, if you're a 2D person, you can rotate the hat to be like this, but you can't get it to this orientation. But we, being in the 3rd dimensional plane, seeing out of the page, can take the hat off of him, flip it around in the 3rd dimension, put it back on him, do him a favor, get his hat turned the right direction. So maybe the same thing is the brain does with 4D math or something, to take this and do a 4D rotation and transform it quickly into that. I don't know, but just things to consider. This is a proposed map of the bank. We've really already gone over all this stuff, but feel free to pause and look at it if you want to. These are regions of the brain that handle specific shape information. Again, if you're so inclined, pause and check it out. So at the back of your brain, the visual cortex V1, V2 splits into 2 paths. The aware path comes upwards and kind of spreads out, not that far, but and then the ventral path kind of goes on the underside of the brain. But there's also the hippocampus kind of close to the end of the what visual stream, which is kind of like a when path, because it's telling you when certain things happened, and it embeds certain triggers and reactivation, stuff like that. The bank, or the visuospatial sketchpad, or the 3D Etch-a-Sketch, where is it actually stored in the brain? Well, like I said, it's probably kind of distributed. But in general, it's going to be, I would argue that it would be fusiform gyrus, lateral occipital cortex, and inferior temporal lobe. Some distribution of prefrontal and parietal, maybe a little bit of involvement with hippocampus. So anyways, thank you for watching this class. The next one will be on frames of consciousness.